Hey, good morning, Chris. Thank you for having me, and welcome everybody to InfluxDays Day 2. Ryan, my partner in crime, and I will be going through the roadmap and engineering update for everybody today. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to start by covering InfluxDB Enterprise. And so for those that may be new to the InfluxData community, InfluxDB Enterprise is our commercial offering, multi-node, managed by you, which means you buy the subscription to the bits from us, and then you get to run it wherever you wish, in your own data center, in a cloud environment, but you manage and run it yourself. And then we're going to talk about what's going on inside the community. I know we've got a deeper community update with Michael Hall later today, but we're going to talk about the community projects and what's going on with Telegraph and some of the great contributions that we're getting from our community members there, as well as what's going on with InfluxDB open source and the roadmap for that. And then Ryan is going to take us through what's going on with InfluxDB Cloud. And again, cloud is available as a free tier offering for those that are new. And then you can obviously switch to a commercial unrate limited plan to scale up and scale out, and it's managed by us. So let's dive right into it. So we're going to start with InfluxDB Enterprise, again, managed by you. Couple of things. Let's talk about team growth and our security posture. These are two sort of important initiatives along two different vectors. So from a team growth perspective, we've actually doubled the size of the team that is supporting and working on InfluxDB Enterprise. And we have been working very hard to prepare our 1.9 release, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We've added significant management depth to this team to manage and run and interact with those of us in product management and our design team. And we've also been investing deeply in our deployment and build automation tools to allow us to continue to build, test, deploy, and run all of the enterprise tests and things that we need to deliver the software at scale. But another thing that we've been really focused on, really starting in 2020, was our security posture overall. We actually completed our SOC 2 Type 2 audit, which is a pretty monumental feat for those of you that have been through that. We've expanded the team size from 1 to 3 as we continue to do things like penetration testing and look at potential vulnerabilities and threat modeling. In particular, many folks may have seen a variety of different attacks that have been happening on folks' digital supply chains. This is certainly top of mind for us and enterprise security for our customers. And we're definitely advancing on the code signing front as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of Telegraph. But this is an area where we continue to focus and something that's been requested and by so many of our enterprise customers. But I think the value that we get out of that is those kinds of engineering investments enable us to do a couple of things. The first is for our enterprise customers, we want you to continue to be successful with the deployments that you manage. So taking InfluxDB Enterprise, running it, operating it for all of your users and developers. And while doing that, we are delivering the new data access and processing features that we've been investing in over the last 2 years. And we're doing that in a way that doesn't significantly perturb what you've currently deployed, meaning we're offering the Flux engine as a side-by-side query engine as part of InfluxDB Enterprise. And soon we'll be offering Flux as a side-by-side engine inside of Capacitor for you to build tasks. And the idea here, of course, is that we're trying to expose and deliver the value that we've been working on so hard to answer all the questions about how do we gain access to data, how do we do more sophisticated use cases, and how do we reduce the number of lines of code that we have to write to be working with time series data, and in particular InfluxDB. And so that's really what's been going on. Now, if you take a look at what's upcoming, this is planned for the first week of June. We're actually starting the rollout of this software for final testing on Sunday. of this week. And assuming everything goes well, we'll have this available to our enterprise customers to download that first week of June. Some significant advancements here. First and foremost, the advancement of Flux. So if you've been on the InfluxDB, either open source or enterprise releases 1.8, we stopped advancing Flux at 0.65. And the current deployed version, I think in cloud is 1.15 or 1.16. And so, the question is why. We made some very significant changes to the language, and we've been working on getting that incorporated for our enterprise customers. This includes exposing query management controls, which allows you to place limits on resource usage and logging queries which exceed those things. We have introduced a number of performance improvements, specifically dealing with last and min and max. And we'll talk a little bit about where that goes from here. But mostly we've been focused on improving the operational experience for customers. In particular, we've gotten feedback over the years about what kind of expanded metrics you need to run and operate InfluxDB as a service for your developers. And so there's a whole series of improvements that are being made available, including looking at detailed cardinality metrics, looking at who's writing data in and into which measurements, and really just getting a more granular view of what's happening. And this should allow you to pinpoint perhaps where things are going astray with one group or another, and quickly being able to address those things. We've also done some mild advancements on the core InfluxQL language to address some requests from our enterprise and community members, in particular, sort of tidying up some syntax for working with tag keys and making that consistent across a variety of our meta queries, as well as continuing to improve performance. And there have been contributions from a number of community members that have allowed us to do that as well. Some highlights that I'll talk about in a little bit. There will not be a companion release, not a 1.9 open source, paired with InfluxDB Enterprise. Now, while all the fixes that we're making are landing in open source, the 1.8 release is really the last feature-bearing release that we plan for open source. And so our enterprise customers can expect us to continue to make advancements and continue on down the road with additional features and capabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about, we'll talk more about that when we get to the community section. Also, a little bit of a highlight is no more 32-bit support for enterprise, and we'll talk a little bit about the impact of that and what that means for open source as well. But our plan is to continue with InfluxDB Enterprise. So we're already working on a 1.10 release in terms of its features and capabilities. You may notice that we're introducing a capability called node labels as part of the 1.9 release. This is a feature just to allow you to put some metadata on the various data nodes and meta nodes for that matter. And then the idea is to leverage this down the road. We've gotten a number of requests from customers about, hey, I'd like to have rack awareness, for example. I'd like to know where I've deployed a particular data node, and I'd like the system to actually take that into account when identifying shards and landing the data within those shards. And so node labels is a stepping stone for us to build on top of to enable that kind of feature and capability. We're also looking at improving the backup mechanisms and including where you might be able to store those backups in a cost-effective manner. We're looking at improvements related to one of the more common sort of errors that happens is from a development perspective is generating data that exists outside of maybe the last 100 years or so. This is based on providing incorrect precision in terms of the timestamp. And so putting more controls in the hands of the operator to sort of designate what is allowed and what is not allowed in terms of those kinds of activities. We're also in discussions with a number of customers around how to implement and support the FedRAMP requirements and FIPS, although I heard today that there's a 140-3 for FIPS that's coming in September. So we're digging into the details of that and a few more things. So I think the bottom line here is we have a very clear path to continue to extend the features and capabilities of InfluxDB Enterprise. And if there's really something that you're looking for, we are eager to talk to you and figure out how we can support those requirements going forward. So please reach out to us through all the normal channels, our community forums, the Slack channel, your sales rep in those cases, and let's chat. Now, also for folks that have adopted Capacitor, this is the next step on our journey of delivering Flux as part of the 1.x line. So effectively, today, if you're using Capacitor for either stream tasks with windowing or batch tasks to do anomaly detection or alerting, we will introduce a side-by-side engine in Capacitor. So the tick script engine will remain, but the Flux engine will appear side by side with the V2 API for tasks. What this means is that you'll be able to define Flux tasks and deploy them inside of Capacitor and alongside your tick scripts. And what this is sort of future-proofing, sort of as we look forward. Flux is the future for all of this kind of processing, and we're trying to provide the longest tail possible for you to get there. In addition, there's new event handlers that are being provided. Xenos is one of them that's there. And we've also backported the Capacitor Enterprise security feature and open sourced it. So this will allow you to pair an open source capacitor with InfluxDB Enterprise and leverage the security settings that we've previously made closed source in Capacitor Enterprise. So we're working very diligently to finish this. Should be available in June, a couple weeks after the enterprise release is available. Again, assuming final testing and everything goes well. So be on the lookout for that. And then last but not least, to sort of finish off the story arc, for those of you that are using Chronograph, there will be a paired instance of Chronograph 1.9 that goes with the 1.9 release of Enterprise and will also interact with Capacitor 1.6. There's a whole list of improvements that we're making from the dashboarding and the log viewer that you'll see here on the slide. I actually saw someone tweet yesterday about using the log viewer with a bunch of event data. That was pretty cool. And so I think it'll work even better, and you'll have some more options for configuring that view and how to use it. Also, we got some feedback on Chronograph HA and kind of smoothing that out. That was released earlier in, I think, 2020, that now you can run Chronograph in a high availability mode. But there were some feedback items about working with secure etcd to handle the metadata, and I think we've worked through and smoothed all those things out. So that should be in a good state for those of you that need a high availability configuration for the UI. All right, so now let's talk a bit about what's going on in the community. Now, as I mentioned, InfluxDB 1.x on 32-bit systems. I want to kind of cover this in a little bit of detail, and it's an important kind of highlight. So first and foremost, there has been an outstanding defect related to running InfluxDB on 32-bit systems. And the issue really comes when you exceed a roughly 3 gigabyte limit for the database size. And typically for those users that have been running on 32-bit systems, you've been effectively using retention policies to restrict the amount of data that instance is running, and you've probably avoided this issue. But for those that have tried to continue to run at higher and higher scale, eventually you'll hit this defect. Now, it's a very tricky thing to address, and one of our intrepid community members dove in and went pretty deep on resolving this issue. And they put up a PR that we've reviewed and looked at in some detail. Now, the challenge is we don't currently have the infrastructure to test and build on for 32-bit platforms. And given where we were in the cycle with 2.0 open source and the sort of rapid decline of 32-bit platforms, our focus has largely been on making sure things work for 64-bit going forward. However, another one of our community members took it upon himself, Simon Vetter, to merge that PR and produce a community build that he has been successfully testing and sharing with others. And so if you're on a 32-bit platform and you need a latest and greatest build, we definitely recommend checking out this link where Simon is hosting that 32-bit version. And we really appreciate the effort that went in from both of these community users to put this together and address this issue. But going forward, our focus is on running InfluxDB 2 and on 64-bit platforms. Now that means we will still produce Telegraph builds to collect and gather data, but the database itself will not run on 32-bit. Of course, intrepid community members could go ahead and try to build that for 2.x, but we would definitely recommend you looking at the patch that was made to work around this large memory footprint issue if you try to go down that path for 2.x. Now, what's been going on also in the community is we promised a limo ride migration from 1.x to 2.x. And the good news here is about 10% of you have taken advantage of that upgrade path. So the limo is available, and many of you have stepped inside to see what it's like. So currently it's an in-place upgrade where we update your configuration. We shuffle the data around on disk. We actually make a full copy of it. At the moment, we create mappings to make it available for the compatibility APIs as well as for Flux. And then we migrate your non-admin users and associated metadata over and do some other things. And of course, one of the things that we've been advancing on with the various releases of 2.x since the initial GA in November is expanding the platform support. So we have ARM builds, we have now a Docker-based install that includes this upgrade and actually a whole rich set of options if you're running in Docker. And for the first time ever, we're officially supporting InfluxDB on Windows as of 2.06, which is great for those folks that are running on the Windows platform. Now, as I mentioned, the limo ride doesn't include drinks, just the limo. So there are some things to look out for. In particular, many of you were running InfluxDB with no authentication, and that is no longer allowed as part of our 2.x, and I'm trying to improve our security posture, as I mentioned. So auth is required by default, and we recommend that you actually turn that on and set up your users before going through the upgrade process. Second, we decided as part of that upgrade process not to manually create, or we decided not to migrate your administrative users. So you'll have one administrative user that you set up as part of the upgrade process, and all non-administrative users will move over. What this means is that you'll either need to manually recreate those other admin users you want if you need them to be administrative, or perhaps it's time to reassess who has that administrative access and make sure that you've got that all tidied up. All of your chronograph and Grafana dashboards will continue to work using the InfluxQL compatibility API, assuming that they're not using administrative access. So that's a key thing to check on, again, before you upgrade. One thing that we have done is continuous queries is not a feature or capability in InfluxDB 2.0 that has been replaced with our Flux task subsystem. So inside of InfluxDB 2.0, you have the ability to define tasks on a schedule. And so all the CQs can be turned into Flux tasks. There's extensive documentation that describes how to do this. And of course, you have questions, just reach out in the community forums or Slack channel. We'll help you through those questions that come up. One of the things that you'll notice is that we slimmed the native protocol support in 2.x. We effectively support only line protocol and annotated CSV on for the write path. And that means if you were using the native Graphite or OpenTSDB or UDP or CollectD style formats, we are now recommending that you run that through Telegraph to do that translation and then send in the line protocol directly to InfluxDB. And as I mentioned, Docker, Windows, and ARM builds, ARM64 builds are all available now as a result of the work that we've been doing since November. And then last but not least, for those of you that are using Capacitor and subscribing to the data that's landing in InfluxDB, our recommendation is actually to use the dual write mechanics of Telegraph to send your data to Capacitor directly and InfluxDB, and everything should continue to function as it did before. Essentially, there are no subscription mechanism on InfluxDB 2.0, but if you send the data to both locations, you'll get the persistence in InfluxDB, as well as continue to be able to run your stream and batch tasks in Capacitor as is. All of this is documented in some detail. What we've tried to really do is provide that limo ride experience, automating as many of these processes as we could, while highlighting exactly what's going on under the covers. And then for those of you that still want to do this on a manual basis, there's additional instructions that you can read and work through. We go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So in terms of what you can expect from a roadmap perspective, 2.1 is up next for us. And there'll be some advancement on our user interface capabilities. In particular, if you've been watching our blog posts and updates, we launched something called the collaboration set of capabilities in InfluxDB Cloud. And Ryan's going to cover those in some detail. But two of the things that are in there are InfluxDB notebooks, which allow multiple developers to collaborate together, and the ability for you to annotate dashboards. There you go. Thank you. And we are delivering a set of Flux performance improvements that have also been proven out on within the cloud environment, including more optimizations for first and last, and count and sum, and windows, and grouping, and more. Performance is never done, and we continue to make advancements, and those will be delivered on a regular basis through both 2.1 and subsequent maintenance and feature-bearing releases as we continue forward. And so, and then as you look down into Q4, there's additional capabilities like advancing the ability for you to define a parametrized flux query as a function that can be called from a variety of places, including dashboards, your code, a task, and more. So today, when you define a task, for example, it's a flux function. It's a flux script that's called on a particular schedule. And the idea is to expand upon that. And Ryan's going to talk a little bit more about the evolution of tasks into functions in the cloud section. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the Telegraph community. So in November of last year, around InfluxDays, we actually invited 3 of our community members to participate more actively in PR reviews, the ability to merge code, and more. And so Sven and Tomas and Pavel have effectively joined our extended team on working on Telegraph. And what this has done is it's really accelerated our ability to review so many PRs and contributions from our community members, and really accelerate the amount of work that can be delivered in our quarterly releases. So Telegraph is on a pretty consistent schedule where it's releasing on a quarterly basis. We'll look at the roadmap for Telegraph here in a minute. But the contributions of these 3 community members, we really want to applaud, and we thank them. It's really been invaluable. And so we're looking to continue to have folks who are interested let us know. But yeah, it's been an awesome experience that we've piloted with these 3 folks, and we look forward to continuing their contribution. They've been awesome. Next slide. All right, let's talk about some of those awesome enhancements that happened in Telegraph in 2020. You may not have kept up on all the advancements since Telegraph releases on a quarterly basis, but two of the things I want to highlight from 2020 that were awesome advancements. The first is previously Telegraph wanted to compile all of the plugins within the single binary. And while we had the ability to do a call out through what's called execd previously, we formalized that across the entire stack from top to bottom so that every style of plugin now can be exposed and called and created through an external process written in any language, so long as it complies with the input and output semantics that are defined. And so you can define external inputs, processors, aggregators, and output plugins across the stack. These are not compiled in, they run out of process and can be called by the various mechanisms that you see here. This allows for both commercial plugins to be created by you that then don't have to be contributed. They don't have to go through the complex, at times, review cycle and sort of complying with all of the checks that we want to run and manage. And it allows you some flexibility to extend Telegraph in directions that you want. So this is great for community users. It's great for new users who are just playing around and may have some existing capability. And then the second thing that we did was there was a ongoing demand for, hey, I want to do some light processing within the Telegraph agent itself. But in order to do that, I'm building an aggregator or I'm building a processor, and that means I have to compile it, and that means I have to deploy it. And so can you give me a configuration, not code mechanism to do that? And so the Starlark processor was integrated into Telegraph earlier last year. It is a dialect of Python, and there's a number of ways that it can be used in terms of doing mathematical operations and logical operations, some string manipulation. You can add and remove tags, fields, and metrics in ways that weren't possible before using the traditional name, pass, and drop semantics that were already included. Yes, there are a number of interesting content pieces that have already been produced out there. One by Sam Dillard. If you haven't seen it, we can, Caitlin or I can throw it into the Slack channel a little bit later. But if you look up Starlark and Sam Dillard, you'll see his tutorial on that. It's a very, very powerful mechanism for working with data before it leaves the source. Definitely check it out. And I know Jamie's asking in the chat in the Slack channel about that. So Jamie will make sure we get you links to that. All right, next slide. And so our latest release of Telegraph, again, for those that may not have been keeping up, was released in March, and we have Telegraph 119, which is planned for June, and a variety of new inputs and output plugins. I think we're approaching almost 300 different plugins that are available and compiled in, as well as a growing number of those external plugins now that you can download and link to. The big deal that you see on here in terms of new features and capabilities, one of the things that that links in with that sort of improved security posture you see is the code signing for Windows and Mac OS. So there are those packages now, when you bring them down, will integrate with the validation mechanisms that Microsoft and Apple provide natively on those machines. So you won't get those annoying prompts or process killed mechanisms if you use that. But I really want to call out, like, Telegraph is such a popular project for our community. Each release, more than 140 commits and 78 different contributors is just massive. And we want to thank all of our community members who participate in this project to make it the best data collection agent on the planet. So thank you all. Next slide. In terms of what to look forward to in Telegraph 119, there's three key advancements that we're looking for. One is simplifying and improving the JSON parsing. We've been able to parse JSON for quite some time, but it worked reasonably well for flat JSON structures. But whenever you got into a nested situation, that was problematic. So that is something we're looking to address and allow you to more flexibility in terms of working with JSON. Second, as I mentioned, InfluxDB 2.0. no longer supports the Prometheus remote write API. And so we looked at the ways in which we could continue to support that using Telegraph. And so a couple of community members got together and wrote the Prometheus remote write parser and serializer so that we can have that capability in Telegraph. So that'll be in 119. It's in the nightly now if you want to grab it and continue on. And then I think the biggest thing that we're hearing from the users of Telegraph is, give me the mechanisms for more dynamic configuration of Telegraph itself. And so we started really with Telegraph 1.9, and we're coming up on 1.19, in the ability to download the TOML file, the configuration file from InfluxDB or any other HTTP target that where you're hosting that file. And what you'll see going forward is our ability to do even more with that kind of mechanism, with a more standardized API, and really pruning down the sections of that TOML file so you can make specific configuration changes way more dynamically than ever. And that work has already started, but it'll continue as we go deeper into 2021. And so I think with that, next slide. I think I am now going to turn this over to Ryan to talk about InfluxDB Cloud. Ryan, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. So good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit about InfluxDB Cloud. So InfluxDB Cloud, as Tim mentioned in the introduction, is our fully managed SaaS service. Offers the same APIs as OSS2, but in an elastic usage-based model for users who want the full features of the time series platform that we offer, but would prefer to consume it as a SaaS service. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've built since our last InfluxDays in London, and then I'm going to give a preview of some of the features and capabilities that are in progress behind the scenes. And when I'm done, we're going to bring Tim back and do a little bit of Q&A. And with Tim here, we'll have someone answer the hard questions. So look forward to seeing Tim again at the end of this presentation. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we first launched InfluxDB Cloud in AWS, and since then we've expanded the service to Azure and GCP. And as we continue to add new regions on a quarterly basis, which by the way we do based upon your feedback and demand, so if your favorite region hasn't been added yet, please reach out and let us know. So we're happy to say that InfluxDB Cloud is now available in all three major providers, AWS, Google, and Azure, in both US and EU regions. We don't transmit or any of your user TSDB data or any of the compute that you do across regions. So you can explicitly select both the underlying service provider and the specific geography if that's important to you for regulatory or privacy reasons. However, the service is equivalent in all of the regions that it's offered in. The next slide. So as you can see, we're going to continue to expand regions across all providers, and our next region coming up here shortly will be our first in Asia Pacific with AWS AP in Sydney. And then shortly after that, we'll be launching another Azure cluster in Europe, AWS Europe, Ireland. And depending upon the uptake and demand that we see in Sydney, we will make a decision on continuing expansion across popular APAC regions. The next slide. So not only is the service available in multiple regions and in multiple providers, but over the last year, we've done a lot of work to integrate with the cloud marketplaces and the OAuth providers so that you can get a better integrated experience with the service provider that you prefer. This has a couple of advantages. It lets you pay for usage through your existing provider accounts. It also means that InfluxDB Cloud usage can retire your committed consumption if you've negotiated a commit with your cloud provider. Upcoming, we'll also be allowing annual contracts, which are sometimes called private plans or private offers, through the provider marketplaces. However, for now, annual contracts require direct billing through InfluxData, which is also an option. And so while we're talking about geography on the next slide, It's exciting to announce that we've added geotemporal capability to Influx Cloud, and we've integrated those features throughout the time series stack. For collecting location data, Telegraph has learned two new geoprocessors, the S2 geoprocessor, which allows you to generate an S2 cell ID from a lat and long field, and then a GeoIP processor, which does GeoIP lookup using the GeoLite2 database and can add a country code into your Telegraph output. Next slide. So for querying and analyzing this geotemporal data, Flux has learned a number of new geofunctions. These are based largely around the S2 implementation that we've integrated. It includes, these are functions that are available in the geo package, and so you can find further definition of these in our online documentation. But briefly, the filter rows function filters data by a specified region. Or you can use a less sugared version of that for GeoGrid filter for a slightly more efficient but less accurate filtering. These geo functions will take a number of different shapes or regions as they're described in the documentation, including a box, a circle, or a polygon, so that you can define different geofences for these queries as you execute them. On the next slide. And of course, we've also added a map backed by a tile server so that you can plot the locations that you've used Telegraph and Flux to get into the platform. So that's super exciting. This has been a very common request, especially for users who use Influx for IoT data. So we're happy to say that you can now both know when and where your things are. On our next slide. So having covered sort of our general theme of geography, let's talk a little bit about our overall roadmap priorities for 2021 with respect to InfluxDB Cloud. So really four: teams, functions, tenant observability, and ease of data movement. Let me just kind of introduce each of these here, and then we'll start talking through some of the features that we're building in these different categories as we go forward to the presentation. So teams, we typically see teams often of 3 to 8 users in a Cloud 2 organization, in an InfluxDB Cloud organization. And we know that the skill sets of these members differ. Some might be operations focused, some may be experts in InfluxDB, and others, of course, will be experts in the domain, in your domain. And so when we talk about teams and collaboration, what we mean are making these groups of developers, operators, and yes, even managers like myself, successful with the time to awesome goal that we have across all of the products and services that we build. Tenant observability is an important part of a usage-based platform. You have to have transparency into your usage. We also include a number of different operational features in terms of operational visibility into this. And so we'll be, over time, improving our visibility to activity and access logs. And you'll see that we've added some features already to make usage easier to understand and to track on your own. A key differentiation of Influx Cloud versus other time series options is the integration of our end-to-end stack from the collection of data with Telegraph and our SDKs through the storage and the analytics and the notifications. And so the ability to integrate relatively sophisticated compute into the platform is something that we really think is critically important. And you should be able to easily connect these functions together, reusing best practices and already tested queries and code. So we're working a lot on allowing the code that you write on the platform to be reusable. And finally, we want to continue, as always, to improve the ability to make it easier to add different types of data to the platform and also to work with batch data, as well as some of the different, more stream-oriented data features that we've built so far. So let's talk through these in some more detail. If we go to the next slide. So first, let's talk about one of the more major UI changes that we've made, and this is notebooks. So notebooks are a workbench, essentially, that bring all of the builder and developer-oriented functionality into a single unified place within the product. This notebook format allows for the user to do some exploration of data. It allows documentation through markdown cells to be integrated into the queries and visualizations that are created. And it provides an environment for refining and sharing the work that's been done on the platform. The notebook format itself is also easily extensible so that as we continue to expand the platform, we have a common framework so that we can gracefully extend the UI in a common paradigm in a way that is easy to learn and use. So currently, you can use a notebook, for example, to build dashboard cells or graph cells, and you can export those visualizations to a dashboard. And this is a pattern that will be spreading across the platform. So currently, while you can define a dashboard and play with data and build a visualization and then export that visualization to a dashboard, upcoming, similarly, you'll be able to use a notebook to define a task, and you'll be able to export a cell from that notebook into a task definition. So we're going to continue to bring more and more of our developer experience into notebooks, continue to make it easier to have at hand the functions and the documentation that are necessary when using the product, and to continue to use notebooks to unify, especially the builder and editor experience within the platform. On the next slide. In addition to notebooks, another fun UI addition recently is annotations. So annotations were one of the most requested features from our 1.x product stack that didn't make our first release management cut for 2.x, and we're really happy to say that they are back. And so the annotations, as they appear now, allow you to annotate a point. You can, of course, add and delete these annotations as needed. They don't expire. They're stored adjacent to your time series data. They can be overlaid across a number of different visualization types. And then coming soon and currently in progress are the ability to define annotations over ranges and to further customize some of the visualization of the annotations that you've created. So you can use annotations to mark important events in time, and we use them already internally for a number of such functions. So on the next slide. So moving on to tenant observability. So usage and observability. So we're currently rolling out an improved access to our platform usage metrics so that you can observe unit consumption, cardinality, rate limit events, errors, and query logs. This functionality really comes in three parts that are user accessible. The first is API level access to the usage data. And so we've exposed your usage data to obviously to your authenticated public API endpoint. Also, we've built Flux wrappers for those API usage endpoints so that you can simply, in a task or in a query, pull from the API into a Flux script that usage information for your own use. And finally, we have a pre-built template that you can install if you just would like an out-of-the-box visualization and some counters for usage. By the way, building Flux wrappers for our API is something that we've been excited to do for a while, and it's a pattern that I think that we'll see continue to expand throughout the platform. One of our goals is around composability. We want you to be able to combine and use all of the features of the platform, whether you're programming internally to the platform through Flux and tasks, or whether you're programming externally to the platform directly against its API. And so being able to bring more of that API functionality into an easy-to-way use in Flux is something that we're excited to do. And this is a first step towards that, to expose some of this usage data in a way that's easier to consume. So we're talking a little bit about Flux. We can go to the next slide and let's talk a little bit about and tasks. So if you're building a real-time time series application, kind of regardless of whether your domain is in the IoT space or monitoring space, you really require a number of different functions to be available to produce the application that you're building. You have to be able to ingest data at an appropriate rate. You need to be able to perform some kind of real-time analytics against that data as it arrives. There's visualization and operational transparency that are important. And you need the ability to act against these events and trends, perhaps using notifications and alerts in real time. So currently, the primary way that we offer computation within the platform so that you can perform analytics of your choice is through Flux and tasks. A task is essentially a cron job for Flux. A task wraps some amount of Flux and then runs it on a schedule. And so if we go to the next slide. We would like to be able to expand the way that code can be triggered and run. And so to do that, what we've done is we've separated out essentially the container, the Flux container, from its schedule, and we've created a new concept that we've cleverly called functions. We thought, what would a developer call a reusable chunk of code that can be invoked? And we thought, that's just a function. And so we avoided one of the harder problems of computer science and naming things. And so, of course, a function can be called on a schedule in the form of a task. However, as we go forward, these functions will also be callable via the API as a remote endpoint, much like a stored procedure. It can be parameterized accordingly. And additionally, we want to allow code to run reactively to events in the platform, so not through just explicit invocation via the API or on a schedule via a task, but as a response to some activity that's been observed in the data or some activity that's occurred within the platform. So if we go to the next slide. And so we have essentially extracted functions from tasks to enable this flexibility. Reusable functions will be rolling out to cloud over the course of May. And these functions will then create a new basic building block on the platform, essentially allowing an encapsulation of some amount of logic in Flux to be parameterized and invoked through some of these different mechanisms, tasks, through the API directly with parameters, or through a reactive function that I'm going to talk about here shortly. So if we go to the next slide. So in addition to on-demand and scheduled functions, we want to support functions that can be invoked, as I've said, reactively. And we call this capability triggers. The first trigger event will be data written to a bucket. This allows two features that have been requested and that we see as commonly useful on the platform. The first is it allows some amount of pre-processing of data to trigger special handling for late arrival dating for data. And secondly, it allows processing of data as it arrives if you want to be able to produce immediately alertable events off of that stream without waiting for a task schedule to process. So essentially, a trigger is a reactive hook. The first version of triggers when it ships will include this single hook event, this write to bucket, and over time we'll continue to add more and more places that you can reactively invoke a function with a trigger in order to create a more reactive and a more programmable platform. Next slide. And then finally, later this year, with respect to functions, we will be adding support for functions that are written in Python. So you can think of these as a lightweight Lambda Python functionality where we will essentially expose the Python SDK to you and allow you to run your arbitrary Python code in a sandboxed environment. We've been evolving prototypes of this feature internally. We've done some demonstrations to a select set of users for feedback, and we're now excited to announce that we'll be building this out for production. We know from our statistics that Python is one of the most popular languages used by InfluxDB cloud users. We want to allow you to use that expertise within the platform as well. And of course, we'll have a lot more to say about polyglot programming overall as these features get closer to release. But currently, InfluxDB Cloud supports InfluxQL and Flux. And in addition to Telegraph, we of course have SDKs in many languages. We're really excited to start bringing more programming tools into the platform, and we're eager to keep building towards improved authoring in the form of notebooks, better function reuse and composability and flexibility of compute in the forms of functions and triggers, and the ability for you to express that computation, the ability to express those analytics in the programming languages of your choice, with Python coming to the platform over the second half of the year. Next slide. And so as I just mentioned, Telegraph and the SDKs, another common need is to bulk load data to the platform in batch jobs versus continuous or streaming fashion. To support that, a number of bulk data features. So the first is a bulk import feature. This is a service that's actually been built and is running internally, that we use this to service largely migration requests from 1.x to 2.x. And shortly we'll be exposing this to users in a self-serve fashion. The first version of this will allow you to upload TSM files to an object store location, to share that location with us, and then the platform will, in the background, pull those TSM files, process them so that they're appropriate for efficient ingest into the Cloud 2 platform, and then load those in the background in a batch job-oriented way, provide a notification to you when that job is complete, along with some statistics about the data that was loaded and some pointers to any data that might have been rejected. Next slide. In addition to the ability to bulk import data, it's really important to us that we provide an efficient way for you to remove data from the platform. Currently, this can be done using Flux, but it's not particularly efficient or always as easy as we would like. And so we'll be building a self-service backup feature that similarly will allow you to create periodic snapshots to your own bucket. This has a couple of uses. It provides a clear path for business continuity. And for disaster recovery, you can have a copy of your data under your control, if that's important to you. Additionally, it allows data to be extracted from the system efficiently for other analytics purposes. And so the first version of this will be to export data to a parquet format. We've chosen parquet here to be aligned with some of the future work that we'll be doing with IOX, which you might have heard Paul talk about yesterday. Advance the slide. And then finally, while we have these bulk import and bulk export or backup features, we're also continuing to improve the real-time or stream-oriented data ingest capabilities. And so we will be building and are building an integration into the native service buses or the native messaging buses of the different service providers. This will allow you to be able to configure data ingest from MQTT or AWS Kinesis or Azure Event Hub without writing any code. You'll be able to simply configure the integration and some mappings, and then the platform will essentially pull the data or participate in those service buses and read data from those buses. So that's super exciting. It's our goal to turn the platform into a Hoover of time series data. We think that it's super important to land data into the platform. It's not the most fun part of any data pipeline project, right? It's just landing data. The fun part is being able to visualize, analyze, and actually get some benefit from that data. And so we continue to put a lot of effort into making data management on the cloud as simple as possible. On our next slide. And finally, one last bonus feature. And so the schema on write feature that's always been part of InfluxDB is, of course, very popular. It allows you to get started very easily. It eliminates really complex data governance that might be required in a strict schema system. And it means that you can turn on a Telegraph plugin and just start receiving data without any additional configuration or administration on the database side. However, a number of users have requested explicit schema because those governance points are important to them in their environments. And so we have added an explicit schema capability. A bucket can be created with a schema, and the schema effectively applies a write filter. So data that is written to the bucket that does not apply to that defined schema will be rejected. The schema capability allows for the widening of a table, essentially the addition of a column to the expressed schema in its first version. However, it does not yet allow a table to be narrowed. And so super excited to be able to offer this schema capability. And with that, I think we have time for questions. So, Caitlin, I guess should I just take the first question here? So can you expand on the rationale behind no 1.9 OSS release? One of the big steps between 1.x and 2.x is using Flux as the primary language, but Flux performance in 1.8 isn't great, and the DBRP mappings for 2x and InfluxQL trip up a lot of people. So yes, we have definitely heard and of course understand technically the performance issues around Flux that currently exist in 2.0. A lot of that has to do with some of the Flux pushdowns that have been shipped to cloud, but are still making their way to OSS 2. So in 2.0.6, we shipped the first batch of those Flux pushdowns, essentially making it more optimal for the query processor to do more lower level calculation to avoid having to apply filters and aggregations against the larger data set. And the remaining pushdowns that exist in InfluxDB Cloud will be landing in 2.0 in the near future when we ship 2.1. It's important to us that we can continue to help the community move towards the 2.0 experience, where we can consolidate and improve our velocity and the features that we're building, as well as the compatibility of those features across our open source and cloud offering. And so not distributing a 1.9 release would be our next step in that process. I do want to stress that that there's a lot of commonality between OSS 2 and OSS 1.x at the TSI and the TSM layer. They're very, very similar systems, and that we will continue to maintain our 1.8 release through the rest of the year, and that the tip of master for 1.x, the main 1.x branch in the InfluxDB repository, will always be CI tested and remain stable and tested by us. We simply won't be packaging and distributing those builds.
Yeah, and in terms of the tripping up over DBRP mapping, so there's a couple comments I'll make. First one is that's completely automated if you use the automated upgrade process. So if you've already been running 1.x, we'll create those mappings for you by default. Where I have seen some challenges is when folks are trying to connect sort of legacy technologies that only work with 1.x at the moment, and they're setting up InfluxDB 2.0 for the first time. And so then they're having to go through and manually do that. So those manual instructions are fully documented, and you can follow them. And I know for the person that asked this question, Jamie, I know you've been guiding people in community Slack to those docs, so I appreciate that. But yeah, I think one of the other things that we heard, right, is when you weren't on the journey with us, right? So if folks are arriving at the point of 2.0, and they didn't go through like what is a retention policy and what they don't have the experience of 1.x behind them, for sure, that can definitely trip people up. And so we're looking to continue to expand the documentation and examples. And we're even going back to some older blog posts and things like that to update it, to make sure it's clear how to be successful for folks that are new and just joining the community now. And it's something for us to keep in mind. Obviously, we've been on this journey with Paul for somewhere between 4 and 8 years, depending on who you talk to. And we're expecting the community to continue to grow, and so we have to make sure those on ramps for folks are in place. And speaking of on ramps, yes, the new versions of Capacitor and Chronograph will continue to work both with 1.x open source and enterprise, and they also work with 2.x because of the compatibility APIs that we've put in place. So I know one of my favorite community customers or community users, is a heavy user of annotations in Chronograph. And some of the things that they wanted to be able to do because they weren't available in 2.x yet, they were just using Chronograph directly and continuing to support those annotations. So now it'll be natively available in 2.0, but they've been able to use Chronograph for some time. Another question is, what version of 2.x can we see the map panel in, or is that cloud only? It's currently cloud only. I know that we are working to see what can be integrated into the open source version. It does currently, the cloud version currently integrates with Mapbox as our tile server provider. And there's no additional charge for that at the moment in cloud. However, to get that working in open source, what we're looking to do is allow you to configure the provider of choice. And so we're just going through the process of figuring that out. And as soon as we have a definitive plan on that, you'll see that appear in the roadmap. Let's see. Is there a support or plan to support for ARM64, AWS Graviton 2 build of InfluxDB Enterprise, Capacitor, and Chronograph? I think we already do builds for ARM64, but
we do. So we haven't. We're not doing any CI testing against those AWS Graviton things, but I believe at this point the entire tick stack compiles ARM64. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
well, a lot of
look
us.
in the
There's a number of there's a number of ARM64 machines now internally to Influx, of course, because of the M1 MacBooks. So I know that the stack it compiles there and is being used there. So we can look at what it would take to distribute that, but it's
yeah.
not a
Look
request
in
that we've heard
the
of.
look in the downloads page. Look for the ARM builds, the ARM64 builds, and they should be there. Try them out and let us know your feedback. I think Ryan already covered this, but let's just hit this again because it's super important. It says, to what extent is 1.x open source still maintained? Bug fixes and security only. So again, 1.8, we will continue to maintain with maintenance releases and security fixes when and where appropriate for the remainder of 2021. However, there will not be additional feature advancement on the 1.x open source line. However, for community members that want to build it themselves off of master, as Ryan mentioned, the master-1.x line will be CI tested and you can build it from source. Let's see, next up, is it possible to transfer data from InfluxDB open source / enterprise on premise to InfluxDB cloud? Sure. There's a variety of mechanisms that you can use to do this. Actually, capacitor is one of them that you can use to do transfer, either in batch or in stream if you want to do that. That's available today, and we are looking forward to increasing the connection between InfluxDB open source and cloud. One of the questions we have for you is we have a whole range of options that we could potentially invest in, right, for connecting open source and cloud. And we are eager to get feedback from the community on what's the most valuable to you. Data transfer comes up a lot, and we have two mechanisms. One mechanism would be just to straight up do a dual write to the open source instance and configure Telegraph to write to both open source and cloud at the same time. That's full fidelity data to both locations. In other cases, what we've heard is we don't want full fidelity. What we want is the data to be downsampled in the open source edition, and then I want to on play that to the cloud environment. So we are looking to get more signal. I mean, we would love to hear more about what people want in terms of those connections. We have templates today for cloud and that will allow you to manage and monitor your 1.x open source instance. So if you want to, typically when you don't want the database to monitor itself. So, if you want to try to use the free tier to monitor your open source instance, you can connect cloud and open source that way. And there's templates for 1.x and 2.x and enterprise already up and available. So you don't have to do anything other than install that into the cloud environment and follow the instructions that are available on those templates. But we'd love to hear more feedback from the community on connecting these things. I think of open source as a edge deployment and connecting that to cloud to make the platform sort of more extensible and broad reaching is what we plan on doing. But getting the clear signal about what's most valuable to you would be awesome. So you can either drop that to us in Slack or the community thread or reach out to us directly. It'd be awesome.
Yeah, and just to perhaps reemphasize on the bulk data features that I was talking about, one of the important uses of that bulk import data is to make it efficient to be able to periodically transfer TSM data in its efficient encoded format to cloud. And so once that feature is available self-service and via the API in cloud, allowing you to bulk upload TSM data, the next step will be for us to provide some tooling to make it easy to reap that data from the edge or from enterprise. And then you can script that transfer at the frequency that you choose if you're not looking for a real-time sync, but want a periodic sync.
Will we be seeing an official Telegraph for AIX anytime soon? No. No plans for Solaris or AIX. You can definitely build that from source. And I think there are some specific instructions that have already been provided about what needs to be excluded in order for AIX to be delivered. And then we've got a question about, is there any plan or date for Enterprise 2.0? No, like our plan at the moment is to continue to deliver the capabilities, the core capabilities we've invested in over the last 2 years, which are primarily around Flux, and provide that API compatibility to our enterprise customers while we figure out what's happening with the future. I think Paul mentioned yesterday in his talk all about IOX, and the availability of IOX will first appear in cloud, and we'll figure out how to run and manage that at scale. And then we'll, after that, we'll determine what that means for our enterprise customers. Let's see, what else? Is there a possibility of obtaining the same CSV format from the 2.x export like the 1.x one, which was more handy? All fields from one measurement in the same row. 2.x format, one row per field is not convenient and is preventing the migration in some cases.
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that's a question we can answer here, but perhaps in the community Slack, you can let us know what is blocking, like what the migration blocker is for this, and we can follow up outside. But I think this is I'd like to understand a little bit more about specifically why this prevents migrations. Perhaps there's something here that we can learn.
Which version of InfluxDB Enterprise would be needed for capacitor 1.8, 1.6 so that tick script and Flux alerts will work? It will actually work with 1.8 Enterprise and above because the API compatibility will be there. So my advice to you is wait till capacitor 1.6 comes out, which should be later in June. But I think ideally, if you want the Flux versions to match, you'll probably want to go InfluxDB Enterprise 1.9 coupled with capacitor 1.6. It's my best guess at the moment. I think we touched on this a little bit already, like what is the best possible way to transfer data from multiple plants to the single InfluxDB cloud instance. Today, if I wanted to set this up and run it, I would probably use capacitor to do batch transfer and processing of the data from InfluxDB, either 1.x or 2.x, and then send it to a cloud instance. You should get all the capabilities to be able to do that with capacitor. Open source to enterprise to cloud, will it work? Yes. Sure, that's a hub and spoke model that we see. So you've got open source like at the bleeding edge, then you have a number of limbs that connect to a thicker part of the tree, which might be enterprise, and many of those potentially running, and then ultimately sending all to cloud. Yes, all of the compatibility APIs are there between those instances. I think that's the other important point. If you're on at least 1.8 of InfluxDB, the read and write APIs are already compatible with 2.x. And that's what's deployed. And those APIs obviously are on the 2.x open source and the cloud environment today. And then Ryan, I think this is a question for you, which is, and I think you touched on this, but maybe we can expand on it. What data can a trigger pass to a function? For example, can it supply the time range of data added to a bucket?
Yes, that is one of the primary purposes of triggers in its first version is to allow processing. For example, if you're running regular downsampling tasks and you know the frequency of that downsampling task and then data arrives that hasn't yet been downsampled, you could use a trigger to notice that based upon the time range of the late arriving data and then reinvoke the downsampler. And so, yes, exactly. You'll be able to use triggers with time ranges of data that arrives in order to make sure that you get at least once processing of things like downsampling.
Okay. I think that's it.
Lots of questions, guys. We actually intentionally went over so that we could get through a number of those questions. But I have one question for you, Ryan. Did I actually really hear you say that InfluxDB is the Hoover of time series data?
Indeed. That is actually one of our internal data acquisition mottos, to be the Hoover of time series data.
That was brilliant. I was listening. I was listening. I know there was a few other questions. Please feel free to pop them into the Slack channel so we can interface with you guys there and get those answered. That was a great presentation. Like always, so much information. And I know everyone's going to ask, so I'm going to just let everyone know now. We are recording this session, so you can take another listen to it. I know I need to take another listen to it, even though I actually saw the deck before. Always learning something new about what the great engineering team has accomplished at InfluxData. So thank you so much, Tim and Ryan. And we're going to now go on to the next section.